Family is supposed to be the place where you are loved and protected, but for me, it became the knife that stabbed me straight in the back. I spent my entire life carrying the weight, providing for everyone, paying off their debts, and believing naively that my sacrifices would someday be recognized. But in just one single night, I became disposable. Everything I had was sold. My future was shattered. All of it traded away for someone else's illusion of glamour and happiness. They didn't just betray me, they erased me. They turned me into a shadow in my own life. That afternoon in Richmond, the sky hung heavy, and a misty rain lay a damp gray sheen across every street. I, Clara Whitman, was sitting in my cluttered attic studio, thick with the scent of oil paint, getting ready for a small exhibition. My phone rang. A woman's voice from the county notary office came through polite but distant. "Hello, Ms. Whitman. We're calling to confirm the recording of a quitclaim deed, signed by you, transferring property to an entity named Whitman Family Holdings, LLC." I froze. Quitclaim deed. My signature, my heart felt like it was being clenched in someone's fist, slowly crushed. My hands shook as I called back, my voice trembling. There must be some mistake. I didn't sign any such document. But the voice on the other end responded with the tired tone of someone used to handling complaints. The document was notarized. If you believe the signature was forged, you should consult an attorney. This may constitute fraud. Fraud. The word hit my ears like a hammer. I opened my email and there it was, a scanned copy, crystal clear down to the strokes of the pen. Under the word grantor was my name, Clara Whitman, but the handwriting was stiff, cold, not mine. I knew instantly. This was the work of my mother, Margaret Collins, and my sister, Isabella Whitman. The room swayed. I gripped the wooden table for balance, leaving a streak of blue paint smeared across it. The house was the only thing I had to show after years of labor. The place I had just finished paying off had been signed away with a forged signature. I called my mother. She picked up after 2 rings, still carrying that graceful tone of a woman who believed she was always in control. "Clara, I'm about to head to the club, so make it quick." I cut in. "Mom, did you transfer the title of my house?" There was a brief pause. Then she let out a dry chuckle. "Don't be so dramatic. It was just a transfer to the family company for better management. It benefits everyone." "Benefits who, me or Isabella?" I hissed through my teeth. "You're still such a dreamer. Clara, art won't put food on your table. Meanwhile, your sister needs capital to expand her law firm, and that house, it's just a dead asset." I scoffed. "A dead asset I paid off with $3,360 a month to help you clear the mortgage, and that's still not enough." "My sweet girl," she lowered her voice like I was a stubborn child. "You need to learn to accept reality. Isabella deserves this. She needs a foundation. You just need a little space to paint. I'm protecting you." Protecting me? No. This was daylight robbery. I hung up. The phone lit up again. This time, it was Isabella. A single message. "Call me. Now." I didn't call. I knew exactly what I needed: paperwork. Evidence. I contacted the notary's office and requested a notarized copy, the notary's log, and the LLC's formation file. The secretary hesitated, then reminded me, "If this signature isn't yours, you need to act quickly. This is a serious case of fraud." I nodded, even though she couldn't see it. In my mind, only one word echoed war. Outside the window, the rain began to pour harder. The phone rang again, and it was still Isabella. I let it ring 3 more times before answering, my voice sharp as steel. Tell me, when you signed my name, did your hand shake at all? There was a few seconds of silence. Then Isabella's voice came through light and syrupy, with poison underneath. You're being dramatic again, Clara. I only did what had to be done. I closed my eyes, but one thought pulsed through me like lightning. If they could forge my signature to steal my house, what else were they willing to take? People often say that weddings are the happiest day of their lives, but for me, mine was built on the very foundation of my own humiliation. That night, I stormed into the Richmond mansion. I didn't knock. I needed to look them in the eyes, needed to hear them admit what they had done. The smell of expensive perfume mixed with polished wood made me nauseous. Margaret Collins, my mother, was in the kitchen, arranging white lilies in a vase. I slammed the printed stack of papers on the counter. The sharp slap echoed through the room. Here, a forged signature. What do you have to say now? She glanced at it briefly, then returned to her flowers. Her voice was soft, almost indifferent. Clara, don't be dramatic. We simply transferred the assets into the family corporation. Legal, safe, and necessary. You know how expensive Isabella's wedding at the Jefferson Hotel was. My chest tightened. Each word pierced like a blade. You used my house to pay for Isabella's wedding. At that exact moment, the back door opened. Isabella Whitman walked into her business dress, hugging her body and her designer purse glittering under the lights. She smiled when she saw me, a smile that hovered between pity and defiance. You came. Look, Clara, there's no need for a fight. It's simple. I needed a solid foundation to grow my law firm, and you, well, you've never cared about anything except your paintings. So what's wrong with a little rearrangement? I stared at my sister, my voice shaking with rage. Rearrangement you call stealing the house? I worked my whole life to buy just to wear a fancy wedding dress. A rearrangement? Isabella shrugged. You're too soft. Clara, Ryan needs someone with ambition and a real career. You were never the right fit. I am. My heart clenched. Ryan Carter, the man I once believed I would spend forever with, I was now legally married to my sister. And worse, the wedding was paid for with my property. I let out a bitter laugh. I've been sending $3,360 every month to pay off family debts. I worked myself to exhaustion thinking I was helping. And what did you do? You forged my signature, sold my home to throw a lavish party. Perfect. To you and Mom, I was just a walking bank account. Margaret finally set the vase down and looked me in the eye. Her gaze was icy. You'll thank me one day. Isabella needs that stepping stone to become a major partner, and with Ryan by her side, they'll elevate this family. As for you, you'll be fine. You're not built for this cutthroat world. I bit my lip until I tasted blood, family, or just Isabella. In that blindingly bright kitchen, I suddenly felt like a stranger. What blood ties are left when you're nothing but a tool they use to climb higher? I gathered the papers, my voice steady, each word weighed. Fine, you've made your choice, but don't think I'll stay silent. I'll take back everything, and when I do, you'll finally understand what loss feels like. My mother gave a thin smile. Isabella crossed her arms, smug in her victory. They thought I'd break again, that I'd swallow my tears and walk away. But in that moment, a cold fire ignited in me. I wasn't the dreamy daughter anymore. I had become someone else. And the question burned into my mind, haunting and sharp. If they were bold enough to steal my house, what else would they dare take? And how would I strike back so that, for the first time, they would finally know what fear feels like? I left my mother's mansion that night with my hands trembling uncontrollably. Inside, Margaret Collins and Isabella Whitman were still standing there, confident and smug, as if everything they had done was just part of some family strategy. And me. I stepped out into the cold Richmond wind, feeling like I had been stripped not just of a house, but of my name, my worth, and my family. I don't remember how I managed to drive back to my tiny apartment. It wasn't until the keys slipped from my hand and hit the tile floor with a sharp clang that I realized I was home. The room was pitch black, lit only by the glow of the street lamp outside the window. I sank to the floor, hugging my knees, listening to the sound of my heartbeat pounding like a war drum. I used to think that if I were ever betrayed, I would scream. I would break things. I would do anything to unleash the pain. But that night, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. There was only emptiness, a hollow void so deep it seemed to suck the air from my lungs. Humiliation spiraled in my head. The image of Ryan bowing his head to place the ring on Isabella's finger. My mother calmly said, "Isabella is more deserving." And that unbearable moment when I realized for years I'd supported them with my own sweat, $3,360 every month, only to be handed a forged document and excluded from a lavish wedding like I never existed. That night, I lay on my bed but didn't sleep. My eyes stayed open, staring at the cracked ceiling, as yellow light from the street formed faded streaks across it. Those streaks felt like cuts, slicing up my memories, me, Isabella, and Ryan having dinner together, me typing away, calculating every penny to send home to my mother, me truly believing I was the one holding this family together. Turns out, I was just a fool. A surge of anger bubbled up. But right after it came guilt. I asked myself, was I wrong for believing that love and sacrifice would be returned? Was it my fault for trusting too much in blood ties? The phone rang at 2 a.m. A text from Naomi Brooks, the only friend I truly trusted. "Clara, you don't have to take this anymore. They've declared war. Then fight back. Don't let them think you only know how to stay silent." I stared at the message, my heart racing. In my head, I heard my mother, "You'll be fine." Isabella, "I'm the better fit." And Ryan, "Clara is too much of a dreamer." I shot up, bare feet hitting the cold tiles. I looked at myself in the mirror. Pale face, bloodshot eyes, but deep inside, there was a flicker of resolve. They thought I would swallow this betrayal with a smile. No. I was going to make them pay, not with tears, but with the collapse of the very empire they were drunk on building. I sat down at my table and opened an old notebook. The blank page trembled with each beat of my heart. I began to write not sketches, not doodles, but a plan to reclaim my dignity, my justice, and more than anything, myself. In the suffocating silence of the night, one thought echoed so loudly I had to say it out loud. It's time. I'm no longer the dreamer. And as the first light of dawn spilled through the window, one question circled in my mind. Where do I begin? And will they ever see it coming that the daughter they dismissed is the one they should fear the most? There's something I've never said out loud, not even to Naomi. All these years, I didn't just send $3,360 a month to my mother. I also carried debts no one ever knew about. I remember the day the bank called. The agent's voice was polite but haunting. "Mrs. Collins's credit card has exceeded its limit. A minimum payment of $5,000 is required this week." My mother just brushed it off. "Clara, help me this time. Your sister's preparing for a big trial. I don't want her distracted." I nodded. Didn't think twice. Just drained the already thin account. I still remember having to urgently sell one of my consigned paintings at the gallery, the one I had hoped would be my first mark in the art world. The exhibition hadn't even opened. The piece was pulled down, wrapped up, and sold off at a disgraceful price just to pay my mother's debt. That wasn't the only time. Isabella's car, a beat-up old BMW, was towed after she missed too many payments. Who stepped in to pay and get the car back so she could drive to her office? Me. I shouldered it all in silence. Never complained. Deep down, I believed I was protecting my family. I thought blood ties would understand and be grateful. But tonight, staring into the naked truth, I see now I was nothing short of a fool. I had turned sacrifice into a habit, and they had turned that habit into leverage. And now, they're using that very sacrifice against me. Naomi once asked, "Why don't you keep something for yourself? Why do you keep breaking your back for others?" I laughed back then, because they're blood. Now I think, blood didn't save me from being robbed of my home. Blood didn't stop me from watching the man I loved slip a ring onto my sister's finger. I got up and walked over to the bookshelf. Between dusty art magazines sat a small brown leather notebook. Inside it were all the receipts, bank statements, and payment slips I secretly kept. I once thought I held on to them to remind myself how hard I had tried. But now, each page felt like evidence of paper cuts of truth, proving they'd been living off my sweat and tears. I flipped to an old page. The bold print read, "Payment posted $5,280. My account number sat just beneath it." My heart clenched. The money I paid to spare my mother from public embarrassment at the bank was nothing but a stepping stone for her to laugh and sip cocktails at the club. I closed the notebook and hugged it to my chest. For the first time in years, I didn't feel ashamed of my softness. I felt angry. A cold kind of anger. Not explosive, but steady. Certain. They thought I was the kind to endure forever. They had no idea I had proof. These pieces of paper, these numbers, would be the blade I used to sever their pride. Outside, dawn was breaking. The darkness slowly receded, giving way to the dull, gray light of a new day. I looked out the window and wondered, is it time to expose everything? Or should I wait a little longer and let them walk deeper into the trap they dug themselves? I used to think I was weak, that silence was the only way to survive. But that night, as I watched my husband stare at the stack of receipts piled high on the table, I knew it was time to turn sacrifice into a weapon. The numbers on the paper, $3,360 sent to my mother every month. $5,280 to keep a credit card from being frozen. The monthly payments on Isabella's car. All of it had once been quite daunting. Now, they were evidence. I gripped the receipt ledger tightly, whispering like a vow, "You forged my signature. Then get ready, because I'm ending this game." The laptop lit up the dark room as I typed into the search bar lawyer. Real estate fraud. Virginia. Notary forgery. Family LLC dispute. Dozens of names popped up. I took notes, highlighted, and circled the ones with experience handling forged asset cases. I knew I didn't have much money to spare, but this time, I wouldn't hold back a single dollar. A good lawyer was the shield I needed. Next, I sat down to sort through every single document, transfer receipts for my mother to one folder, bills I had paid off for Isabella in another, bank confirmation letters in a third. Everything was clipped and categorized neatly, like I was assembling a war file. If my mother and Isabella thought I only knew how to keep quiet, they'd soon see that every dollar I spent left a trail. Around 2 a.m, I called Naomi Brooks. She answered groggily, but after just a few words, Naomi understood. "So you finally decided to strike back. I don't have another choice," I said. "Naomi, I need a lawyer. And if it comes to it, I want the media involved. They don't get to hide this." Naomi was quiet for a few seconds, then replied sharply, "All right. I know someone who once broke a major story on forged property documents. I'll send you her contact in the morning. But Clara, you need to be sure you're ready." I looked around the room, papers spread across the desk lamp casting shadows over my worn-out face in the mirror. My heart was racing, but I wasn't trembling anymore. "I'm ready." They pushed me to the edge. The next morning, I brought the entire folder to a law office. Harold Grant, a salt-and-pepper-haired attorney, studied each page carefully. He paused on one bank statement that read clearly, "Payment posted $5,280. His brow furrowed slightly. "Ms. Whitman," he said slowly, "what your family did isn't just unethical. It's criminal. If we gather enough evidence, we can request the court to freeze any accounts related to Whitman Family Holdings, LLC. I nearly held my breath. Freeze, meaning they can't touch a single cent. "At least not until the court makes a ruling," he replied. "But you should know, this will fracture your family even more. Are you truly prepared for that?" I laughed bitterly, but firmly. "Family. I'm not suing my family. I'm suing the people who forged my name." Walking out of that office, the cold wind slapped my face, but for the first time in months, I felt light. I had made my first move not as a pawn, but as someone ready to fight back. And in my mind echoed one daring question. Now that I've flipped the board, will my mother and Isabella realize they were the ones who walked into a trap? Just 1 week after meeting with the lawyer, I saw the first ripple take effect. One morning, my phone buzzed nonstop with notifications from the bank the account of Whitman Family Holdings. LLC had been temporarily frozen by court order. I sat by the window, sipping my lukewarm coffee, the corners of my mouth curling slightly. It was a strange, yet familiar feeling, like finally completing an important stroke in a painting I'd been working on for years. That afternoon, Naomi sent me a screenshot from social media. A former employee at Isabella's law firm had posted a cryptic status, "Lavish weddings can't pay overdue salaries. Justice may be slow, but it arrives." Over 100 shares in just a few hours. I didn't have to look far to see the consequences. My phone rang. Mom's number. I let it buzz for a while, then finally picked up. Her voice trembled. "Clara, what have you done? The family account is frozen. I can't withdraw a single cent. Isabella is furious, and Ryan is blaming everyone. Do you have any idea how many contracts your sister still needs to sign?" I kept my voice calm and even. "I haven't done anything. The court just wants everything to be transparent. Who told you and Isabella to use my forged signature?" On the other end, heavy breathing, then silence. For the first time, I heard something missing in Mom's voice. Her usual certainty, a crack, a fracture. The next day, I happened to run into Isabella at the parking lot near the office building. She was walking fast, face gaunt, with dark circles under her eyes. When she saw me, she froze mid-step, her gaze flashing with both anger and fear. "You must be real proud of yourself, huh?" she snapped. "All this destruction over a bit of money dragging the whole family into the mud." I looked her straight in the eye, calmer than I had ever been. "Family? The moment you and Mom forged my signature, you erased the word family. I'm just letting the law do its job." Isabella clenched her jaw but said nothing more. She turned around, her heels striking the concrete with sharp, echoing thuds. To me, it wasn't just the sound of fury. It was the sound of someone losing control. That evening, Naomi and I sat in our usual cafe. She slid a local newspaper across the table. On page 3, there was a full article, "Prominent legal family under investigation for forged signatures, assets frozen." Beneath the article were dozens of comments. Many were outraged. Someone even called Isabella the queen of forgery. I took a deep breath. My heart was still racing, but instead of panic, there was a bitter sense of satisfaction. After years of being invisible, the truth was finally starting to leak into the light. I looked at Naomi, half smiling, half serious. This is only the beginning. Once the cracks spread, their whole castle will collapse. And then, a question echoed in my mind as clearly as a bell. Would Mom and Isabella have the strength to withstand the coming storm, or would they fall apart at the very first fracture? The news broke faster than I expected. One morning, my phone buzzed nonstop. The family group chat, which I had stayed silent in for months, now exploded like a beehive torn open. Messages flooded the screen, Isabella. "Clara, what the hell did you do? My biggest client just pulled out. Mom, do you have any idea what kind of consequences this has? The press won't stop calling me Ryan. This is a mistake. We need to talk." I sat in my chair, sipping my coffee, my fingers sliding past each message. A strange feeling filled my chest, sharp pain mixed with satisfaction. After all those years of being dismissed, now they were the ones tasting helplessness. That afternoon, Naomi emailed me a scanned copy of a court notice the bank account belonging to Whitman Family Holdings. LLC had been frozen indefinitely pending investigation. That meant not a single cent could be moved. Every invoice, every expense is now under scrutiny. Later in the day, my phone rang again. This time, it was attorney Harold Grant. "Ms. Whitman, the bank just informed us they're unable to release the loan Isabella recently signed. Her purchase deal for that office building has collapsed. We hit the exact nerve." I closed my eyes and imagined it Isabella slamming her phone in rage, Ryan yanking at his hair, Mom trying to maintain her elegant composure while trembling on the inside. That evening, I happened to replay the recording Naomi had advised me to keep. Mom's voice cracked. "Clara, by doing this, you're cutting off your own family's escape route. You're destroying your own blood." I whispered to myself, as if answering the whole world. "No, you and Isabella destroyed me long ago. This is just justice catching up." The next day, the media ramped up. A bold headline on the front page of a financial paper read, "Isabella Whitman's law firm reels after forgery scandal, contracts falling apart one after another." In the comments section, readers sneered, "No amount of luxury weddings can cover up the truth." My phone kept buzzing like a storm. But this time, I didn't avoid it. I let it ring. I let them panic in the very chaos they had created. Naomi looked at me and smiled faintly. See, they used to think you were weak. Now, with just one move, their whole castle is shaking. I sat quietly, a strange clarity washing over me. Yes, I felt triumphant. But deep down, there was a quiet sadness. How did the people I once called family ever push me to become their enemy? I closed my eyes, exhaled slowly, then picked up my phone and typed one final message into the group chat. You started this game with forgery. I'm simply letting the law finish it. Then I put the phone down. In the quiet room, I asked myself, this is only the beginning when the court delivers its verdict. What more will they have to lose as the legal storm spread? I knew it was only a matter of time before they came, and they did. That afternoon, there was a rapid knock on my apartment door. I opened it to find Margaret Collins, my mother, standing there. Her face was pale, a stark contrast to the cold composure she usually carried. In her trembling hand was a luxury handbag. Clara, she said in a voice so soft it was almost unbelievable. Can we talk? I folded my arms and stood firmly in the doorway. What do you want to talk about, forging my signature or using my house to turn Isabella's wedding into a lavish show? She blinked repeatedly, her voice trembling. Sweetheart, I know I was wrong, but I only wanted to protect the family. Now that the court has frozen our accounts, I can't manage anything. If this goes public, our reputation will be ruined. Clara, can you withdraw the complaint? Let's handle this privately. I let out a dry laugh. Privately? Did you think about handling things privately when you forged my signature? She was speechless. Her shoulders slumped. For the first time, she no longer looked like the Iron Woman who always seemed to control everything. She looked small, even pitiful. But that pity wasn't enough to erase the truth of what she had done. Before I could say anything else, heels clicked in the hallway. Isabella Whitman appeared, eyes red but voice sharp as ever. Happy now? Just because you're personally angry, you dragged the whole family down? The press is calling me the queen of fraud. You must be thrilled. I looked at my sister, voice calm, but each word cutting like a knife. You did this to yourself. That title wasn't my invention. It was born from your own actions. Isabella clenched her fists. You've always been jealous of me. I'm better. I'm the one Mom chose. And you just couldn't accept that. That's why you wanted to destroy me. I smirked. If you were really better, you wouldn't need to steal my house or use my ex-husband to prove yourself. Isabella froze, her eyes flashing with rage. Right then, my phone buzzed. A message from Ryan Carter. Clara, I need to see you. I had no idea things would go this far. Please give me a chance to explain. I exhaled, a sound mixed with sarcasm and bitterness. Explain. Now they all wanted to talk about consequences. I looked at my mother and Isabella standing before me, each with a different tone, one begging, the other accusing. Inside me, there was no chaos, only a cold clarity. Listen carefully, I said, voice steady. I didn't start this war. You did when you stole my name. Now, I'm just letting justice do the rest. The door slammed shut in their faces. I leaned against it, taking a long breath. The knocking continued, Isabella's shrill voice mixing with my mother's desperate pleas. But to me, it was just distant noise now. In that moment, I asked myself, when desperate, will they pause to face their mistakes or keep dragging others down with them? I had always thought that the moment of going public would make my heart tremble. But when it finally came, I felt an oddly calm stillness. Maybe it was because I had endured too much, for too long. It was Naomi who suggested it. "Clara," she said, "don't let this lawsuit unfold only in the shadows of a courtroom. They used public opinion to humiliate you for years. Now it's your turn to strike back with the truth." I nodded. That Monday morning, I sent the complete set of documents verified by my attorney, receipts, statements, and forged signature evidence to 3 major newsrooms in Richmond. No harsh words. Just a short headline, words from the betrayed, "I am no longer my family's walking bank account." That same afternoon, the story spread like wildfire. Headlines filled the press: "Forgery scandal at Whitman Family Holdings. Artist Clara Whitman exposes her own family." Under each article, hundreds of comments exploded. Some were outraged, others were shocked, and many quietly offered empathy. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. One reporter called, his voice breathless. "Clara, can you confirm on record that your signature was forged, your assets seized, and that both your sister and your mother were involved?" I took a deep breath and answered calmly, "Yes. And I have the evidence. If anyone still doubts me, let the court decide." That night, I opened social media. Notifications were flooding in. People were sharing my story, and other victims began speaking out about being financially exploited by their own families. One comment made my eyes sting. Her story reminds us that sometimes walking away from people who don't value us is the only way to save ourselves. Meanwhile, on the other side, my family was reeling. Naomi sent me a video clip from a press conference. Isabella Whitman stood surrounded by reporters. She tried to stay composed, but her voice quivered. "This is a private matter. We will resolve it within the family." A journalist pressed forward. "But do you deny the forged signature evidence?" Isabella fell silent. Her face turned pale. Beside her, Ryan looked down, avoiding the cameras. "And my mother. She called me at midnight." Her voice cracked between rare sobs. "Clara, I've lost everything. My friends have turned their backs on me. The club won't have me anymore. Are you satisfied now?" I closed my eyes, heart heavy. There was no triumph in me, only a sense of release, as if I had finally put down a burden I'd been dragging for years. I answered slowly, "I didn't make you lose everything. You did. I only brought the truth into the light." When I hung up, the room was so quiet I could hear the sound of my own breathing. I knew, in that moment, there would be no turning back. And in that silence, I asked myself, now that the truth has been made public, have the final threads between me and them been cut forever? When the truth was finally exposed, there was nothing left to hold on to. The last shattered pieces of what used to be called family disintegrated in the whispers of public judgment. A few days later, Ryan Carter sent me a message. "Clara, I'm sorry. I was wrong to let myself get swept away. I thought I was choosing the right path, but it was all just an illusion." I read it over and over again. Then I deleted it. What value does an apology have when everything has already collapsed? Naomi told me that during a small gathering. Ryan had admitted to his friends that he felt trapped in a loveless marriage and part of a law firm that was falling apart. But I didn't feel sorry for him. Everyone has to pay the price for their own choices. As for Isabella, I heard she lost her two biggest clients. One of them flat out said, "We can't work with someone who was once involved in an identity fraud allegation." The once arrogant look in her eyes had now turned into sheer panic, and Margaret Collins, my mother, completely withdrew. The woman who once strode into country clubs with a smug smile no longer dared to show her face. She called me one last time. No more tears, just a dry, hollow voice. "Clara, I have nothing left." I stayed silent, not out of satisfaction, but because in that moment, I felt a cold emptiness. The kind of family I had tried to hold together with love and money turned out to be nothing more than a sandcastle. One quiet evening, I sat with Naomi on the cafe porch. She gently asked, "Do you feel lighter now?" I nodded. Not the kind of nod that comes with victory, but one that feels like the aftermath of a storm, when the trees have fallen and there's nothing left to struggle against. I whispered, "Some bridges have to burn so we can finally find our way out." We sat in silence, listening to the wind pass through the glass windows, and for the first time, my heart felt weightless. I knew, with absolute clarity, that this relationship was broken beyond repair. There was no going back. But instead of pain, I felt free. Free to live as myself. Free to begin a new journey. One unbound by condescending stares or sweet words laced with knives. And I want to share that feeling with you, those of you listening to this story. Because sometimes, the most important question isn't, how do I fix this? But do I have the courage to let go and rediscover myself? If this story resonates with you, please leave a comment below. I want to hear from you because maybe your experience could become a source of strength for someone else. And if you've been walking with me through this journey, don't forget to subscribe to Bitter Scars, a place where our wounds speak not just of pain, but of rebirth. I thought that once the truth had spread, they would stay silent, left to sort through their own ashes. But no. One weekend evening, I received a message. "Clara, we need to meet. One last time." It was from my mother, Margaret Collins. I nearly refused, but some part of me wanted to end this face-to-face, once and for all, with no more hiding. The small riverside cafe was quiet that day. When I arrived, I saw my mother, Isabella, and Ryan already seated. 3 faces, 3 different expressions: mother, worn and tired; Isabella, tense and on edge; Ryan, staring down, too ashamed to meet my eyes. I sat down. No hug, no greeting, just a heavy silence hangs between us. My mother spoke first, her voice hoarse. "Clara, I know we can't go back to how things were, but can you at least stop dragging this out? You're making us look like fools." I looked at her cold eyes, but my voice was calm. "Fool's mother. We're not a laughingstock because I brought the truth into the light. We're a laughingstock because for years, you chose to close your eyes to the truth. You chose one child and discarded the other. You turned me into a walking wallet and dared to call that protecting the family." Isabella shot up, her hands trembling. "Stop it. You've always been jealous of me. Are you happy now?" My law firm collapsed. My clients are gone. "Ryan," her voice cracked, "are you satisfied?" I turned to my sister, a bitter ache rising in my chest. "Do you think I'm happy to see you suffer? No, Isabella. But I am relieved that you finally see the truth. Being chosen by mom doesn't always mean you've won. Sometimes it's just a trap." Ryan finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "Clara, I'm sorry. If I could go back." I cut him off. my voice firm. You can't. You made your choice. You left me at my weakest, chasing the glittering fantasy my mother painted. And now that same fantasy is choking you. You have to live with that. The air turned thick. I looked at the three people in front of me, people who once were family. My heart tightened, but for the first time, it didn't tremble. I stood up, my voice clear and unwavering. I'm tired of pretending we're a loving family. I'm done wearing that mask. From this moment on, I am no longer your crutch, no longer your wallet, and no longer the shadow you can take advantage of. This ends here. My mother began to cry. Isabella turned away, biting her lip. Ryan bowed his head, shoulders slumped. I turned my back and walked out of the cafe, leaving behind a suffocating silence. The night breeze brushed past me, cool and steady, and I realized I had truly severed the ties. And in the quiet of my mind, a single question echoed after this confrontation. Will they keep trying in vain? Or finally let me go after the confrontation at the cafe? I stepped out into the night with a strange feeling. There were no more tremors in my chest, no invisible weight pressing on my shoulders. Instead, there was a rare quiet, like the storm had just passed, leaving behind a sky so clear it made you want to cry. That evening, I didn't turn on the lights in my apartment. I sat by the window and let the moonlight pour in, casting the entire room in a soft, gentle glow. Amid the wind and the distant hum of the city, I felt my heart fall silent. For the first time in years, the silence wasn't frightening. It no longer resembled abandonment. It was the beginning of freedom. Naomi called, her voice hesitant. Clara, are you okay? After that night, I was afraid you might fall apart again. I smiled. A breeze-light smile. I'm okay. Naomi, more than ever. I've realized I don't need their validation to exist. I've spent my whole life waiting to hear Mom say, I'm proud of you, waiting for Isabella to look at me with respect. But those things will never come. And the important part is, I no longer need them. There was a pause on the other end. Then Naomi softly said, So you've finally seen yourself. I froze. She was right. I was no longer a walking wallet, no longer the shadow of a spoiled younger sister. I wasn't the daughter who had to trade every dream for scraps of affection. I was Clara Whitman, and my worth did not lie in their hands. In the days that followed, I began to slow down. I woke up early, walked along the James River, and breathed in the cool morning air. I returned to painting the passion I had set aside to help the family. The feeling of holding a brush, the paint staining my fingers, that faint chemical smell. It made me feel truly alive again. One Sunday morning, I finished my first painting in years. A sunrise scene with golden light stretching across a sparkling river. When I hung it on the wall, I didn't just see a landscape. I saw a new version of myself, steady, independent, and radiant. That night, I sat down to journal. Each word felt like it carved itself into my soul for the first time in years. Silence is no longer a pit. It's a bridge bringing me back to myself. I no longer wait for a voice from a home that isn't mine, or for praise they'll never say. I wait only for me, and at last, I found that girl again. I set the pen down, my heart lighter. A thought flickered through my mind, perhaps. To find your true worth, you must walk through the very edge of betrayal. I smiled faintly. The journey wasn't over, but I knew this for sure from now on. I would no longer carry my wounds as burdens, but as proof that I was brave enough to let go. I used to think my story would end within the confines of a broken family, but life had other plans. When the truth finally came to light, it didn't just put an end to the lies surrounding me, it accidentally opened a door for many others. One morning, as I sat in my usual coffee shop, a woman in her 50s approached me. She wore a simple coat, her hands trembling as she held a cup of tea. She stopped at my table, her eyes red and swollen. "You're Clara, right? I heard your story. I was like you once. I spent my whole life working to support my husband and kids, and in the end, they treated me like a maid. I thought I was the only one suffering." I froze. Her voice shook, but there was a light in her eyes, as if she had finally found an ally. I reached for her hand and said softly, "No, you're not alone, and you're not useless. They were wrong to make you believe that." That day, we sat together for hours. She talked, I listened, and I realized my pain wasn't some isolated case. It was a mirror reflecting the silent suffering of so many others betrayed by their own families. After that, Naomi suggested, "Have you ever thought about writing your story, sharing it, so people like you can find strength?" I hesitated, but one night, I opened my laptop and started typing, and there was no sugarcoating or hiding, just the truth. I posted it on a small forum for women and justice. To my surprise, within days, hundreds of comments poured in. People shared their stories, someone whose siblings stole her inheritance, someone betrayed by a husband, someone abandoned by their parents. They wrote, "Thank you for speaking up. I saw myself in every word." I read every comment, feeling both heartbroken and lit up inside. I was no longer just a survivor of a family tragedy. I had become living proof that it was possible to rise, to reclaim your voice. One afternoon, my phone rang. A journalist from the local paper wanted to interview me. At first, I hesitated, afraid of being seen as someone who just wanted to dig up the past. But then I remembered the woman from the coffee shop. I remembered the hundreds of messages, and I said yes. The article was published with the headline, "From the Shadows of Betrayal, She Found Herself and Gave Strength to Others." After the article, I received even more emails and phone calls. Some people even wrote to say that, because of my story, they finally had the courage to walk away from toxic relationships and fight for what they deserved. I sat in my apartment, watching the messages come in one after another, and a strange feeling rose in me. My story didn't end here. It had become a flame, lighting the way for others. I let out a quiet sigh, my eyes brimming with tears, but my lips curved into a smile. I realized sometimes, from the deepest scars, we grow the strongest seeds. And I wondered, could this just be the beginning of something much bigger than I ever imagined? My story didn't just resonate with many people. It caught the attention of those in the legal world. And then, what I had known would eventually come. Did a formal investigation was launched? I still remember the morning I received the envelope from the court, a subpoena, with the names Isabella and Ryan printed at the top, along with my mother's Margaret Collins. My hands trembled, but strangely, I didn't feel fear. What stirred inside me was a sense of resolution. This was no longer just a family matter. This was justice. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was packed. Bright white lights beamed down, and every face in the room looked tense. I sat in the plaintiff's row, facing my attorney, a sharp, relentless woman named Elaine Turner. known for her refusal to back down in cases involving financial fraud within families. Isabella entered the room with a pale face, her hair tied tightly back, but the dark circles under her eyes were impossible to hide. Ryan followed closely behind, avoiding my gaze, and then my mother dressed in a dark blazer, her silver hair neatly combed, yet the proud demeanor she once carried was now an empty shell. The judge struck the gavel, his voice echoing throughout the room. This court is now in session. One by one, the evidence was presented: forged contracts bearing my signature, suspicious money transfers, and testimonies from bank employees. Every time a document was raised, I could see Isabella's face fall further, while Ryan lowered his head even more. My mother remained silent for nearly the entire session, until Attorney Turner asked directly, "Mrs. Margaret Collins, do you admit to directing the use of your daughter's assets without her legal consent?" The courtroom fell completely silent. Slowly, she raised her head, her weary eyes scanning the room, and then she answered quietly, "Yes." A wave of whispers swept through the room. I felt the very air shatter around me. That answer wasn't just an admission. It was the final punctuation mark at the end of a long sentence built on lies. The judge took notes, then announced clearly, "After reviewing the evidence and testimony, the court finds Isabella Collins and Ryan guilty of personal asset fraud. Margaret Collins is found to be complicit in the act of forgery. The court orders the immediate freezing of all related accounts and refers the case to the Criminal Investigation Department." The sound of the gavel echoed with finality. I sat still, flooded with a feeling I couldn't quite name. It wasn't triumph, nor bitterness. It was relief, like the last heavy door had finally closed. Isabella broke down in tears, and Ryan reached for her hand, but the two of them looked like drowning souls grasping at nothing. And my mother? She sat motionless, her eyes vacant, as if she had aged 10 years in just a few hours. I stepped out of the courtroom and took a deep breath of the outdoor air. The late afternoon sun fell gently on my face, and in that light, I realized justice never comes early, but when it does, it liberates. And in that moment, I found myself wondering, now that this verdict has been reached, can I truly begin a new life free of burdens, free of bonds, or will the scars remain forever after the trial? I returned to my small apartment. No fireworks, no cheering crowd, just silence wrapping around me. But it was that very silence I had longed for all this time. I poured myself a cup of hot tea and sat on the balcony where the evening sunlight gently faded. Inside me, there was no longer tension or turmoil. My heart had returned to its natural rhythm, calm, slow, and full of hope. A week later, I decided to leave Richmond. I needed a new space, a place where old memories no longer clung to every street corner, every cafe. I moved to Asheville, North Carolina, a small city nestled in the deep green mountains. There, I found closeness with nature and, above all, the peace I had always yearned for. My new home sat on a hillside overlooking a wide valley. In the morning, the fog draped everything like a soft silk scarf. At night, the chirping of crickets and the bright moonlight became my companions. No one knew who I was. No one connected me to the noise of a family scandal. I was just an ordinary woman, finally free to start over. Naomi came to visit. Her eyes lit up when she saw the new paintings I had hung on the walls. She smiled and said, "You know, this is the first time this place actually feels like your home." I hugged her and quietly replied, "Maybe it's the first time in my life I feel that too." I opened a small art studio not to sell, just to teach neighborhood kids how to paint. They came, laughing, leaving messy streaks of color across the tables. I would sit and watch, my heart glowing with a simple joy. I didn't need awards or validation from a family that had once betrayed me. Just those smiles were enough. One afternoon, while putting away the kids' paintings, a thought crossed my mind. If I had never dared to let go back then, maybe I'd still be trapped in that endless loop of sacrifice and betrayal. Sometimes, to save yourself, you have to burn a few bridges behind you, and I had done just that. My mother, Isabella, and Ryan still had to face the consequences of the verdict. I no longer kept track. I had learned that not every battle is worth staying in until the end. Some battles you win just by turning your back and walking away. That night, I wrote the final page in my journal. The past does not define me. The scars are just proof that I survived. I don't need apologies. I don't need recognition. I only need myself free, peaceful, and strong enough to move forward. I closed the notebook and leaned against the window frame, listening to the night wind blowing through the forest in front of me. One chapter had ended, and I, Clara Whitman, was finally stepping into a new one. In the end, as you close the pages of my journal, you may realize something: no pain is meaningless, even when it comes from the ones we love the most, even when it's the deepest betrayal. It can open the door to our rebirth. I have lost, I have fallen, but I have also risen and found my true worth. If this story made you cry, if it brought back an old wound in your heart, know this: you are not alone. There are people like me, and there is this community where we share, listen, and find strength. Leave a comment, share your story, and don't forget to subscribe to Bitter Scars, because sometimes it's our scars that become the most beautiful proof of human resilience and strength.